Support for public expenditure, a multivariate regression analysis. The data set used is the 2012 American National Election Study. The concept being measured is support for public expenditure. The approach I will be using is a multivariate regression analysis, which includes a reliability analysis, a correlation matrix, and the use of hierarchical regression. The debate on government spending was at the forefront of the last election. Research by Bell and Entman shows that attitudes towards spending are actually deeply contradictory even at the individual level. A study found that Americans support levels of equality similar to those in Sweden when they didn't know they were supporting a Swedish policy. I'd like to explore exactly what it is that affects this. The indicator for my dependent variable, support for spending, is an index combining support for health expenditure, education, unemployment benefits, pensions, and welfare benefits. Respondents had the options of much more, the same, somewhat less, or much less spending. The data were recoded so that support for expenditure would receive the high score. In constructing the index, a reliability analysis was performed. After deleting the variables for defense and industry, I ended up with an alpha score of 0.74, which could not be increased by deleting any others. The result was this raw index. The median is 12.45, which means half of the cases are below that number and half above. The mode value is 12, telling us that this is the value under which the highest number of cases fall, and the mean, which is near the middle value, tells us that this is a normal distribution with most of the cases falling near the center. My first independent variable is party identification, which was recoded into a set of dummy variables for the purposes of a multiple regression analysis. Democrats were omitted as a reference category because they made up the largest group. Trust in government, measured by the question, how often can you trust the federal government in Washington to do what is right, was recoded so that the high score went to highest amount of trust. Gender was also recoded into a dummy variable called female because I wanted to see the effect of being female as opposed to being male on expenditure support. I had three initial hypotheses to which a fourth will be added later. My first is that party identification should affect support for public expenditure, with Democrats tending toward higher support and Republicans lower. One of the Republican Party's defining principles is that of limited government. Jacoby suggests that partisanship tends to supersede rational decision-making skills for much of the public. According to him, partisanship, and even the phrase government spending, are symbols that automatically give people cues as to how they feel about an issue without much deliberation. My second hypothesis is that trust in government should positively affect support for public expenditure. Rudolph and Evans discussed the significance of political trust on attitudes toward public expenditure. Heatherton also stresses the importance of political trust to the ability of governments to legislate effectively. Taken at face value, this makes sense because those who trust the government to spend their money effectively will be more supportive of that spending. Thirdly, being female should positively affect support for public expenditure. Rudolph and Evans found that support for government spending is greater among women than men. This may have to do with some of the aspects of spending being deemed stereotypically as women's issues, such as health and education. A correlation matrix was produced to calculate the amount of variation each of the independent variables can explain in support for public expenditure. The data in the correlation matrix support the first hypothesis that party identification affects support for public expenditure. Looking at Pearson's R for support by Republican in the first column, we can deduce that relative to Democrats, Republicans are quite a bit less likely to support public expenditure. For public opinion data sets like this one, negative 0.3036 indicates a fairly strong negative relationship. Since that number squared is 0.092, we know that being a Republican explains approximately 9.2% of the variation in support for public expenditure. Independents and those in the other category were also less likely to support public expenditure than Democrats, but the relationship in this case is not as strong. The significance values of 0.000 indicate that these relationships are very unlikely to be due to chance and very likely representative of the population. The second hypothesis argued that trust in government should positively affect support for public expenditure. The matrix shows that while this is true, the relationship is weak. Government trust would only explain about 3% of the variation. The last hypothesis looked at whether gender affects support for spending. Despite findings in the literature that it did, this was not the case for my analysis. Although the relationship was statistically significant, it explained almost no variation. It is clear that partisanship is much more useful for explaining variation in public expenditure than either trust in government or gender. Moving on to a multiple regression analysis, the asterisks denote the significance levels of the variables, which all indicate statistical significance. The B value for the Republican dummy tells us that support for expenditure held constant. Republicans are 2.24, or a little more than 2 categories lower in support than Democrats. Independents and those who identify with other parties are respectively 1 and 1.8 categories less supportive. Unsurprisingly, Democrats have the most positive relationship with support for spending out of all the party identifications. The B value for government trust indicates that a 1 category increase in support for public expenditure is associated with about half a category increase in government trust. The same is true for gender. 1 unit higher in support is associated with half a unit higher in terms of being female. However, B values are not necessarily good indicators in terms of comparing the two variables because they are measured in different units. The beta values are useful for looking at relative explanatory power. In this case, they show the same strong negative relationship we've been seeing from the correlation matrix between republicanism and support for spending, and the same weak relationships for the other variables. So the regression analysis basically confirms the findings of the correlation. The tolerance scores for all the variables are above 0.7, so collinearity is not a problem. Adjusted R-square is 0.138, telling us that this regression explains about 14% of the variation in support for public expenditure altogether. Now that I know republicanism is my strongest explanatory variable, I want to take a closer look at it by controlling for age and the relationship between partisanship and support. My rationale here is that the elderly would have an interest in higher public spending because they are more likely to need Social Security and Medicare in the immediate future. So I created a dummy variable from the ANES age demographic question in which the value of 1 was given to those above 65 years of age. This brings us to my last hypothesis, which is that this will be a case of specification, in which Republicans who are older than 65 will have less of a negative relationship with support for spending than those under 65. This is my hierarchical regression in which I controlled for old age, and the result was actually replication. Both the beta scores and explained variation basically did not change, contradicting my hypothesis. The results suggest that there is a strong relationship between partisanship and support for public expenditure and weak relationships in terms of gender and trust in the government. That means only my first hypothesis was proven true. While it is somewhat surprising that trust in government plays such a small role in people's support for public expenditure, this analysis may provide further evidence for Jacoby's theory that partisanship supersedes rationality. If the public make up their mind on this highly divisive issue mostly based on partisan cues, then it would not matter as much how much they actually trust the government to spend their money. Same is true for senior citizens not supporting expenditure any more than their younger counterparts. It is possible that government spending is more of a symbolic and political issue than a pragmatic one. A question that may result from this is whether citizens basing their preferences on partisanship is good for democracy. One could argue that government trust and self-interest should factor into people's decisions. Thank you for listening.